Welcome everyone to the seventh and final webinar in our Forestry Taxation webinar series, where we hope you will learn all you need to know about forestry taxation. Last time we learned about choosing a form of business and other tax issues. And today we're going to hear about understanding Oregon's property and harvest tax programs from our speaker and forestry taxation expert, Clint Bentz. In the chat, I shared the link to our website where you can find the materials for today, as well as slides, handouts, and videos from previous sessions. You probably also received these materials via email earlier today, and hopefully you have downloaded those materials for today's session. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to type in your questions at any time. We'll wait until the end, and Oregon State University's forestry taxation expert, Tammy Cushing, will guide us through the question and answer portion of the webinar. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Clint.
Thanks, Amy. This is our last session, as Amy said, and because it's our last session, and this is on property taxes, and so we're going to go over the property tax system. And so we'll have questions about that. But if you have questions about anything that we've covered over the 7 weeks that you just haven't had a chance to ask yet, please go ahead and put those into the Q&A also. And Tammy will be curating those questions as we go through. And so when I finish the presentation, we'll deal with all of your questions that you have. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with today's session. So we've been going through the 7 weeks and talking about lots of different topics. We're on our last one here, which is understanding Oregon's property and harvest tax programs. So what we're going to look at today is we'll look at an introduction to the special assessment programs, look a little bit at the history of our property and harvest tax programs. I think sometimes it's hard to understand what's going on down in Salem with these measures if we don't kind of understand where we have come from. There's reasons why the systems are in place the way they are, and so we'll address those. And then we'll look at the forest products harvest tax, the small tract option severance tax, and the various special assessment property tax programs for HBU forest land, designated forest land, small tract forest land, the farm woodlot program, habitat, wildlife habitat conservation and management program. All right, so let's get started. So this intro to the special assessment programs. And if you have your handout, we're starting here on page 3. The thing to remember about these programs, they were put in place to encourage the commercial production of timber here in Oregon. Oregon is still a big timber state. People like to think we're the Silicon Forest still, but really Oregon is still the Persian Gulf of timber. We are #1 in softwood and plywood production here in Oregon, and we are #1 by far over the next states in those categories. And so we are still a big timber state. Timber is still our biggest farm gate, and so these special assessment programs were put in place to encourage the commercial production of timber for products, for lumber, for plywood, for all the 3,000 different products that come out of our woods. In order to make this happen, we realized that the property values, and the same thing for farmers, that the property values that we use for taxation purposes are based on their productive value, not on their fair market value for any purpose. And so if you have some land in the urban growth boundary that could be subdivided into houses, but instead you choose to raise a forest on it, you're going to be taxed as that land as forest land, just like any other commercial forest land. So be taxed at the same value that if this was commercial forest land being bought and sold by Weyerhaeuser and the other big timber companies. Also, then most timber harvests are subject to the forest products harvest tax. And when we harvest timber, we have the forest products harvest tax. Pretty much everybody but the tribes are subject to the forest products harvest tax. And if we're enrolled in the small tract forest land option, there's also a severance tax that is due upon harvest in addition to the forest products harvest tax. Anytime we do work in the woods, not just harvesting, but really any type of work in the woods, it's subject to the Oregon Forest Practices Act. And in order for the Department of Forestry to oversee those activities and make sure that we are complying with the Forest Products Forest Practices Act, we have to file a notice of operations. And there's either a notice of operations or obtain a permit to use fire or power-driven machinery. And so we apply for this notice of operations for all types of work, including harvesting timber. I've got the website up here, ferns.odf.oregon.gov/e-notification. This is the site where you can actually apply for this notice of operations online. It's a free service. You are required to file the notice 15 days before you start the operation, so that the local forester for ODF has the ability to review what you're going to do, and if they need to, they can comment on it and come out and also oversee what you're doing. So let's talk about the history of our property tax and severance tax, harvest tax systems. So this information in the materials I sent out a couple of appendices. The first appendix is a report that was written by the department, the Legislative Revenue Office, on a history of forest taxation. And this was prepared for the 1999 legislature. This was prepared when we were doing our last major rewrite of the timber taxation. So we started off back in 1856, which was statehood. And remember, between, from the time of statehood until we imposed this, Oregon decided to impose the income tax in 1930, property taxes were the primary source of revenue for the state and for the counties. We had old growth timber, the first settlers that came here. We had this, what they was seen as kind of a found resource. And so timber owners paid taxes on the value of the timber and the land together. And this timberland was remote, and all the money went to the state. And so the county assessors were pressured to keep the values down so that the county didn't have to pay an unfair share of their tax. So as these lands were logged off, and many of the property owners, basically, they considered the land worthless. They logged it and then they left it, and they were having to pay the property taxes. And so they basically just stopped paying the taxes and let the properties go back to the counties. And a lot of the land that the counties own today is a result of these forfeitures that occurred back in the early 1900s. So to stop this from happening and encourage people to actually do forestry and encourage replanting, in 1929, legislature passed what was called the Forest Fee and Yield Tax. So these lands that had the old growth timber on it, they were cut over. They paid a 5 cents per acre forest fee, and then they paid a 12.5% yield tax when they harvested the timber. So this they paid 12.5% of what they received from the sale of the timber when it was sold. That program was repealed in 1977 and phased out over a 25-year period. It was finally repealed in 1999, before the 25-year period was over. So, but this forest fee and yield system, rather than just have the property and the timber all valued together. Between the end of World War II and 1961, we had a housing boom, timber prices are going up. They were concerned about the values. They realized that the value of the timber on the county rolls was significantly understated. And so they also saw that as the values were going up, timber started getting cut prematurely because people didn't want to pay high property taxes on the value of their standing timber. And so they were cutting these stands early in order to avoid paying property taxes on them. So in 61, the legislature changed the system. Eastern Oregon, they just exempted timber from the tax rolls. And then they put a 5% severance tax in, basically in lieu of the property taxes on the timber. So they basically charge 5% of the value of the timber that was sold, and to replace those property tax revenues that were lost when they took timber off the ad valorem tax rolls. Same time in 61, Oregon set up two new systems. They had a partial property tax exemption for those lands that had the land and the timber being taxed. And then they also created the Western Oregon Small Tract Option Tax, the WOSTOT, for small landowners. So the partial exemption program basically exempted all timber that was under 12 inches in diameter, breast high. And then the larger timber, they put it on the rolls at 30% of what they call the immediate harvest value. So it was a formula where they looked at the timber standing today, they looked at the cash flows that would come over rotation, they present valued that back to the current value to receive what would the immediate harvest value of this timber would be, even if it wasn't merchantable, or based on the value of the timber that it would be over its rotation. And then 30% of that value was put in as the property tax rolls. Then they also had a tax 70% of the value harvested times the local tax rate. So again, they basically taxed 30% as you went, and the remaining 70 was taxed at the property tax rate when it was harvested. The WOSTOT program basically allowed people just to pay tax on the land, the productivity value of the land, and not the timber at all. And so, and they set the value of the land based on the productivity of the land. At that point, they had 5 site classes, classes 1 through 5. So after the 61 legislature, we had 4 tax programs. We had in Eastern Oregon, we had the Severance Tax program where the property taxes timber was not off on the property tax rolls. Then they had a severance tax when you harvested timber. In Western Oregon, we had this partial property exemption where you were taxed on the land and 30% of the value of the timber, with the remaining 70% of the value paid at harvest. They had the small tract option program in Western Oregon, which also had a severance tax at harvest. And then they still had the forest fee and yield tax system, which was being phased out. So again, realizing that the timber was growing in value and people were starting to complain about the valuations. So there was a lot of work trying to do that. And by 1977, the DOR, the Department of Revenue, revalued all the timber in Oregon and came up with a number that was more than twice what the current value was. And of course, the timber was included on the property tax roll. So this was a big, big deal for landowners. So it created a big fight. 1977, there was a class action lawsuit. And while the lawsuit was going on, we had a massive timber harvest. Basically, all the old growth that was owned on private land, pretty much all of it was harvested during this time because people didn't want to pay, basically have their property taxes doubled on the value of their timber. So then 1977 legislature, they had a new tax program went in. It exempted standing timber from the property taxes. So they took timber off the rolls entirely in 77. And then they put in a 6.5% severance tax to basically replace the property taxes on the timber. So you had, on an annual basis, you paid taxes on the land, and when you harvested, you paid property taxes on the timber when it was severed, 6.5%. They established a system to distribute that severance tax to the counties, and they basically went back and put the values at the values for the land before the proposed doubling of the values that had been put in place by the DOR. They also at that point completely repealed the forest fee and yield. They repealed the forest fee and yield tax system, and that was going to be phased out over 25 years. They did that in 77. They left WOSTOT alone. In 81, we had an index land system for Eastern Oregon. We set the value at $25 an acre, and it was going to then increase by basically the timber values. That tax court case on the values of the forest land that started in late 70s, 77, dragged on and finally settled in 83. 6 years later, it's 3,700 pages in the transcript. Basically, the tax court upheld the new values. But the Supreme Court, when it went all the way to Supreme Court, they basically split the baby and they said, okay, the values are halfway between what they were before, what the Department of Revenue said, and they basically then said everybody owes back taxes based on the difference. And so there's $24 million that had to be ponied up by the landowners based when that court case settled. The 89 legislature also determined that intensively managed hardwood stands, we were in a chip shortage at that point, and people were raising these short rotation fiber farms, the hybrid poplars. And so they said there was going to be there was a 12-year rotation on those, and we would treat it as agriculture, not timber, similar to the Christmas trees. 1990, 1991, we had the ballot measure 5. So ballot measure 5 limited the rate of tax to 1.5%. And then we had these, so that was property taxes. Privilege taxes, or taxes for the privilege of doing business in Oregon, are not subject to the ballot measure 5 limitations. And so they temporarily redefined the forest products harvest tax and the severance taxes as privilege taxes, even though they were clearly property taxes, because they were imposed in lieu of the property taxes that were on the timber. Basically, the timber industry then sat down with the legislature, and with support, they basically reduced, people agreed to reduce the severance tax rates and exempt them from the ballot measure 5 limits over a phase-in period. So we didn't have a drop off of a cliff. They basically said we'll have a gentle landing, because everybody realized these were property taxes that were subject to the ballot measure 5 limitations. And so they basically had kind of a slow phase down of these taxes to lower rates. While this was happening, we had the spotted owl listing and the marble murrelet listing, and timber harvest on the federal lands declined 87%. It went from almost 5 million board feet to about a little over 600,000 board feet. So, and the total harvest declined almost in half, a little over half, from 8.7 million board feet to 4.1 million board feet. So it was a large reduction in the amount of timber that was being harvested. The 93 legislature, as they were working through this, they basically adopted a series of findings and policy statements, because at that point, all the, remember 77, most of the old growth was harvested. By 93, almost all the timber that was being cut in Oregon was timber that had been replanted. It was second growth, some third growth timber. And they basically said, look, the timber industry went and said, we're not putting a severance tax or privilege tax on wheat or corn or strawberries or any of the other agricultural crops in Oregon. And really, timber is an agricultural crop too. This is a crop that we have planted, and there's no reason, this is not a found resource anymore. We're not mining timber. This is a renewable resource, and therefore it should not be subject to property tax at all, because, just to be fair, we're not subjecting the crops on the ground and ag land to property taxes. We shouldn't be subjecting timber to property taxes. They came up with a new site class system for valuing the forest land. They had one site class for Eastern Oregon, and then they had multiple site classes for Western Oregon, 8 of them, and they came up with the values, and basically they put in some privilege taxes. They did some other things in 93, and they still kept the WOSTOT program. 95, they exempted machinery equipment from the personal property tax that was used in logging. And then ballot measure 47 and 50 came along, which reset the value of the land. So we'd already taken timber off of the property tax rolls, and now we had the land reset. And so the forest land values declined quite a bit, although because we had the privilege taxes that were not subject to limitations, the net decrease was a lot less than what the amount of money that was come in did not decline as much as what the forest land values did. So so there was a lot of energy and effort that went in there. Basically the land values reset to the 95, 96 values and increased 3% a year, along with all the other land values in Oregon. The 97 legislature increased the acreage limit for WOSTOT up to 5,000 acres. Before that, it was only 1,000 acres. So now we had 5,000 acres, and they created the Wildlife Habitat and Conservation and Management Program, where somebody who wasn't managing for the production of commercial timber products could also receive special assessments if they were managing their land for critical wildlife habitat. 99 was the big year. They imposed a new system for taxing forest land. And that's really the system that we have. It was modified again in 2003, but the 97 legislature basically set it up where we're going to have the forest land values and basically saying we're not going to have a privilege tax anymore for harvests because the timber is a crop. We shouldn't have to have a privilege tax harvesting a crop. We don't charge a privilege tax on any other crops. So starting in 2003, they're going to do away with the privilege taxes. The forest land values were going to be indexed on a model, and and so all of the large land ownerships were now going to be taxed 100% of their land value and not have a privilege tax. The small owners basically were given a transition period because we realized the WOSTOT program, which had been in place since 1961, was too expensive to administer, and so they realized they needed to come up with a new system for small woodland owners, and they basically directed the 2001 legislature to do that. 2001 legislature didn't get it finished, so they passed it on. So by the 2003 legislature, we had these new bills, 2197, 2188, which are the bills that form our current system that we have today, which basically created two programs. The first one is the designated forest land program. This is for all owners of 2 or more acres of forest land. And so beginning in 2004, all landowners were transferred in this program unless they opted into the new STF program, which we'll talk about in a minute. And there was so all the land went in, the land was assessed at 100% of the value based on the site class system, Eastern Oregon, Western Oregon, and based on basically real market data, what commercial forest land was being sold for. And then they also had some models that they used to take that raw data and try to assign it to the various classes. No privilege tax at harvest. The small tax forest land option was put in the STF program as a replacement for WOSTOT. So it was for owners they had to have between 10 and 5,000 acres of forest land. If you basically under 5,000 acres, if you had 5,000 or more, then you couldn't be in the STF program. The STF program was designed to help small woodland owners manage their cash flow. So you first had to sign up for the forest land program, the designated forest land program, and then you got into the STF program. So designated forest land program set the values of the timberland at what commercial timberland sold for. The STF basically said, okay, we'll charge for STF programs, you'll only be assessed at 20% of that reduced value. So 20% of the forest land program value based on the site class of your land, that would be your annual assessment. And then at harvest, you would pay a severance tax. And the severance tax was modeled to basically make it revenue neutral, so that if you basically paid your tax based on the forest land program over a rotation, or if you paid the 20% of the tax and then had at rotation you collected the severance tax, the tax rate was set so that both landowners over that 60-year rotation, whatever the rotation was, would pay the same amount of tax. And so with also the assumption that all the tax has been paid. So if somebody it was looked at, if you just did a harvest and then you put the land into the STF program, then that would be, you'd have that amount of tax to pay. And so if you're doing kind of an annual sustained yield harvest, basically you would have basically the same amount of tax. If you're doing kind of a sustained yield harvest off of your land, the severance tax is probably the equivalent, it should be the equivalent of the 80% of the tax that you're not paying, of the property tax that you're not paying. So that was the small tract forest land, was to make it just so that the small landowners could manage their cash flow. They're not paying any less tax over the rotation age. They basically pay the same tax as the people in the forest land program. And that's how it was designed to operate. The repealed WOSTOT and the forest products harvest tax remained in effect. So that's kind of a brief history of kind of where we are, how we got here. So right now today, we're taxed based on basically the productive value of the land, what the land is selling for commercially between commercial timber companies. And then we pay a harvest tax at harvest. And if we're in the STF program, we pay a severance tax, which is defined as a privilege tax. So it's not a property tax, but it's designed that it basically collects over basically all the people that are in the STF program, not landowner by landowner. So the landowners do not have basically a unpaid tax. Basically for the entire program, what is coming in through the severance tax is designed to basically be something, the similar amount to the reduction, the 80% reduction in the property tax. So let's look at the forest products harvest tax. So who has to pay it? So the person that owns the timber when it's first measured is responsible for the tax. And so on page 3, I've kind of got some different examples here. So basically, if you sell a timber deed, so you sell standing timber to somebody and then they remove the timber, the person that bought the timber deed owns the timber when it first gets scaled. And so they're responsible for the tax. If you sell the land and the timber together to somebody and the new owner then harvests the timber, they're responsible for the tax. If you deliver logs to a landing and then they're sold from the landing, as long as they didn't get scaled before they got to the landing, then the person that that has the logs on the landing, the purchaser of the logs on the landing is responsible for the tax. Generally, though, when you're sending logs to landing, they're running across the scale on their way to the landing, and so then you would be responsible for the tax. Finally, if you're just selling logs delivered to the mill, then the landowner is responsible for the tax. And so on the notice of operations, there's 3 people that are listed. There's the operator, the person who's doing the work. There's the timber owner, which is this person that owned the logs when they ran across the scale, and then the landowner. So all 3 people are measured. It's the timber owner that is the one that gets the form and is responsible for paying the tax. Most tribal lands are exempt from the tax, but government and private lands are subject to the tax. So anytime we do a harvest off of government land, they pay the harvest tax, or I guess we all do through because it comes out of the government coffers. And of course, all private lands are subject to the tax. We pay the harvest tax. It's based on the board feet that we harvest, and it's on the logs or the chips produced in the woods that are harvested of utility grades and better. So that includes utility and utility and better grades. The coal grades are not included in the harvest tax. So we have to compute all the, we get the scale tickets for everything that's utility grade and better, and that's what is the volume that we've sold is what's subject to the tax. There's been a recent change. These forms used to be mailed out in late in the year, and then they were due by January 31st. That's now changed. The forms are mailed out in January and they're due on April 15. Department of Revenue will allow a 30-day extension. You have to request the extension. It has to be postmarked by April 15. They can say no. You have to tell them why, and I've got the information in your handout, what you need to include on the extension request, but they can only extend it for 30 days. So the maximum you can go is basically 30 days after April 15, so about May 15. It's not an extension. That extension is not a extension of time to pay the tax. It's only extension of time to file the return. And so you need to make sure you get, if you're going to owe something, that you make a guess as to what you owe, so you don't have an underpayment penalty. The first 25,000 board feet that you harvest during the year is exempt from the tax. And so you on the form, you have all your harvest, and then you get to deduct 25,000 board feet, and then that gets you your net board feet, and that's what's subject to the tax. The tax rate for the harvest tax is this year is $4 and $4.1322 per 1,000 board feet. And that tax, it's a specific tax. Like I said, it's a privilege tax. It's basically a tax that the forest industry has assessed against itself for things that are good for us, the things that it's kind of, we're funding things that are important to us. And so out of that $4.1322, $1.12 goes to OFRI, the Oregon Forest Resource Institute, one of the sponsors of this program here. So, and basically OFRI doesn't get any public money. The money that comes to OFRI comes through the harvest tax, which is a tax on the harvest of timber. So we fund OFRI $1.12. We also, the Oregon Department of Forestry gets $1.38, almost $1.39 per 1,000. That is for funding their work with the Forest Practices Act. Under the law, that can't exceed 40% of the amount of other dollars that come in from the government. So basically 40% of the Forest Practices Act, all the salaries and everything involved with the Department of Forestry implementing and enforcing the Forest Practices Act is paid for by the landowners through the harvest tax. 90 cents goes to the Oregon Forest Research Lab. 62.5 cents goes to the Emergency Fire Fund, which funds our part of the Emergency Fire Fund, and that's a landowner contribution to that. And so we pay for about half of the cost to put out fires, and the general fund pays the other half. And then the OSU College of Forestry gets 10 cents for their work and for forestry extension. If you think you're going to owe more than $1,500 of tax, then you're required to pay estimates. And so if you're going to have a big harvest during the year, and $1,500 divided by 4.1322 is 363,000 board feet. So if your harvest is going to be 400,000 board feet, and more than 363,000 board feet, and you're planning a harvest of that size, then you need to be making estimate payments, and those estimate payments are due. So you have to pay 25% of what you're going to owe, and you have to pay that on April 30, July 31, October 31, and January 31. So you're required to make estimate payments if the value is going to be over $1,500. You probably want to make an estimated payment by December of the amount you think you're going to owe, even if you're not over that dollar amount, so that you can deduct this harvest tax against your timber revenue. Again, depending on the type of, most of us don't harvest every year. And so you want to take this deduction because the harvest tax is it's deductible expense for both state income tax and federal income tax. So this is not an income tax, and it's not a property tax. This is an expense of doing business. And so that tax is deductible against your income if you pay it within the same tax year where you got your revenue. you pay it, the following year, then, you may or may not be able to deduct it, depending on if you have any income in the following year. The small tract forest land severance tax. This only applies to harvest on lands that are enrolled in the STF program. So when you enroll in the STF program, you basically have to put in an entire tax lot and any contiguous tax lots. And so the Department of Revenue has all those tax lots registered in their system. And so when you file a notice of operations, and you have to, in the notice of operation, you have to tell them where the harvest is going to occur, township, section, range, that information, that will trigger them not only to send out the harvest tax, but if that township, section, range information overlaps a tax lot that is enrolled in the STF program, then you're also going to get an STF form. And the STF form, and so I'm on page 5 in the handout now. So it's a form OR 390, and then there's one for Western Oregon and Eastern Oregon because the tax rates are different in the west side and east side. So the severance tax only applies to lands that are enrolled in the program. If you're doing harvests on lands that are in the program and not in the program, then it's up to you to identify the harvest that came off the STF lands, and you pay the severance tax on those harvests only. Unlike the harvest tax, where it's all logs and chips produced in the woods of utility grades and better, for the STF severance tax, it's of sawmill grades and better. So the utility wood that comes out is not subject to the severance tax, even though it is still subject to the harvest tax. And so we've got a little bit different calculation for volume that's subject to the tax between the two, between the severance tax and the harvest tax. Again, the forms are mailed out in January. They do April 15. The Department of Revenue will allow 30-day extension as long as it's postmarked by April 15. It's, again, an extension of time to file, not a time to pay. There is no 25,000 board foot exemption for the severance tax, so the entire harvest, sawmill grades and better, is subject to the tax. And then we have these rates, and the rates change annually. So the Eastern Oregon, the rate is $4.78 per 1,000 board feet. The Western Oregon rate is $6.15 per 1,000. Again, that rate is designed so that over a rotation, a landowner would pay basically the same amount of tax through their paying property taxes on the 20% of the value, and then paying the severance tax when they harvest. That you add those two together, and it basically would be the same amount as they would have paid if they would have just been in the deferred forest program for the entire time. The difference is just the ability to manage the cash flow. So you don't have to write the check for the property tax when you don't have any money coming in from your forest land. Unlike the harvest tax, which funds programs that are important to the family forest landowners, the severance tax, because we reduced the amount of property tax revenue that was coming to the counties, the severance tax gets divided up among the counties basically the same way that the property tax does. So 60% goes to the common school fund, 35% goes to county funds, and then there's a community college fund that gets 5% of those taxes. So they are distributed to the counties, and they go into those county funds because in effect, this is a replacement for the property tax that counties are not receiving because of the reduction in the assessed value for the landowners in this program. There is no requirement for estimated tax payments for the severance tax. However, again, you're going to want to estimate what you're going to owe and write that check by the end of December so that you can deduct it against your timber harvest revenue. Now, so that's at harvest what happens. Now let's talk about the property tax systems. This is the tax on the land. So we have something called highest and best use forest land, or HBU forest land. These were lands identified by the counties back in the mid-1900s that said, this ground, really all it's good for is growing trees. Nobody's ever going to put a subdivision here. It's not industrial land. It's not farmland. It's just kind of holding the world together, and it grows trees. And so those kinds of lands were identified by the counties as basically, this is their highest and best use. And so the value of these lands should be based on their value as forest land and not some other arbitrary value. So the HBU lands and the designated forest land, which is land that landowners put into forest land. They basically, it doesn't matter. You're in the urban growth boundary, right next to a housing development. If you've got 2 acres and you want to plant trees on it, you can basically have that 2 acres taxed the same way as those HBU lands are up, up in the mountain ranges. Those values are set in statute. They're adjusted annually based on the value of forest land. The Oregon revised statutes require the Department of Revenue to certify the specially assessed values and the maximum specially assessed value of bare forest land on or before June 1 of each year. I actually, in your materials, I included the table for the values for this last year. So again, market sale data is the primary source. They're supposed to look at this annually. They also use models, and so it is market driven, but it's also, they take that market sale data and they put it into a bunch of models to come out. And they also, there's a working group that gets called together every so often to kind of look at what the department is doing with these values and making sure that the values are reasonable and they are following where the market is. So the designated forest land program, you have to apply. So HBU lands are already identified by the assessor as being a forest land, and they're being taxed and assessed as forest land. The designated forest land program, so if you've got land that you want to have taxed as forest land, you have to apply with the county assessor by April 1 if you want it to be in that year. The property tax year runs from July 1 to June 30, and the property tax bill for that year comes out in November. So if you apply by April, your November tax bill will see the assessment for that year. The county assessor is required to approve your application as long as the land meets the requirements. So what are those requirements? It has to be at least 2 contiguous acres, but we don't have, it's not bound by tax lot. So it can be 2 contiguous acres, a half an acre in one tax lot and 1.5 acres in another lot. You draw the line around it and say, this ground is going to be taxed as designated forest land. The land has to be held for the growing or harvesting of trees of marketable species for the production of commercial wood products. So the designated forest land program is for people that are raising timber for the production of commercial wood products. A lot of people in the environmental community are unhappy about this, and they basically say, that well, we're through this program, we're encouraging the cutting of trees, and says, well, that's exactly what we're doing. We're trying to encourage this because this is such a huge market, or such a huge economic driver for the state of Oregon. They have to meet minimum stocking requirements of the Forest Practices Act. So, 200 trees per acre for you to grow in 5 years, or there's different age groups. There's minimum stocking requirements. So you have to have that on the ground, or if the land has just been cut over, so you have some brushy area or some pasture or something, you have to have a plan that within 5 years it will meet the minimum stocking requirements, and you have to plan at least 20% per year for 5 years to get it up to those minimum stocking requirements. And if you do have that plan, you do that, then they'll let the property go into the forest land program. If you've got rock pits, roads, and other land uses that are integral to the operations, but it's not growing trees, it's okay as long as it's kind of a de minimis amount. The majority of the land, the vast majority of the land, has to be raising trees in order for it to qualify in the designated forest land program. If the landowner wants to get out of the program, or the property is disqualified, then there's a bill that comes due, and the bill is the difference between what the taxes would have been if it would have been assessed at its highest and best use versus the taxes that were paid, that you'd actually paid based on it being valued as commercial industrial forest land. And so the difference in tax for up to 5 years, depending on how long you've been in the program, it's every year, but no more than 5 years, that amount of tax plus interest then is added to the following year's property tax bill. The small tract forest land program, again, allows those small landowners under 5,000 acres to pay a reduced property tax. It's designed to be revenue neutral. You first enroll the property as designated forest land, so it has to qualify as designated forest land before it gets into the STF program. The property is then valued basically at 20% of the designated forest land value. You again have to apply with the county assessor by April 1 in order for it to be in the STF program that year. And again, the county assessor is required to approve the application as long as the property meets the program requirements. What are those program requirements? The landowner has to have at least 10 acres of forest land. Now, you don't have to put that 10 acres of forest land into the STF program, but you have to own at least 10 acres to qualify to get into the program. If you own more than 10 acres, and again, less than 5,000, so if you're in that group, then there's no minimum parcel size. You can have a parcel that's a half an acre, 1 acre, and have that be in the STF program, and that be the only one that's in the STF program. However, the restriction here is that you have to put the entire tax lot and any contiguous tax lots that have timber on them into the program. And what they meant by contiguous is if it touches on, the tax lots touch on more than 1 point. So they have to, it has to have a little bit of overlap between the two lots. So if it just touches on a corner, that's not contiguous. But if the property lines overlap at all, then those two have to be enrolled. It's an all or nothing deal. You put them both in, or you put neither one of them in. If you get out of the STF program, there's a 10-year rollout of the tax between what the tax would have been on the designated forest land program and the tax on the STF program. So again, as many years as you've been in the program, up to 10 is the maximum, and that gets rolled out, but there's no interest that is due on that rollout. That's just added to the following year's tax. The difference between the tax you would have paid under the designated program and what you actually paid under the STF program. We have home sites on our forest land. So home sites that are located on the land are valued separately from the forest land. But if the land is in a designated forest land program or the STF program, we do get a reduced value on the home site. Home site, what is the value of the home site? The value of the home site is the difference between what is that parcel worth if you can't build on it versus what is it worth if you can build on it. And home site value can be, 50, 80, $100,000. It's a fairly substantial, it's a very valuable thing to be able to develop or have a home on a piece of rural land. And so, and that's just the site, not including the house. So if your property is in designated forest land or the STF program, actually the same thing true. If you've got farmland and special assessment, it's the same thing for those people too. They basically take the home site and they look at what is the value of all of the land that you own that is contiguous to the home site. So the home site's, touches on 3 different parcels that you own, or there's one, or if it's sitting in the middle. They take the average value of the land that is contiguous to the home site. They take that number, and that is the value of the home site. So we basically value the home site the same as the value of the land that's in the special assessment program. They can add up to $4,000 for site improvements like the well, the septic, landscaping, and stuff like that. So that's the value of the home site. So it's significantly less than the real market value of the home site. The value of the home and the other improvements that you have on the ground, those are valued at real market value, subject to the maximum assessed value under ballot measures 47 and 50. We also have a farm woodlot special assessment. So if you're in the ag, if you're a farmer and you're either, whether you're an EFU or not EFU zoning, if you have farmland and you're farming it and you have a woodlot that's adjacent to your farmland, so you can take up to 20 acres of that woodlot and have it be specially assessed as farmland, and based on its value as farmland rather than as highest and best use land or something else. So up to 20 acres, and that's 20 acres per farm unit. So if you've got, 300 acres of farmland over here and another 200 acres of farmland over here, they're separate parcels. Each one can have a 20-acre woodlot adjacent to the land and be included. There's no application that's necessary. Those woodlot acres are not counted in determining the per acre gross income test. So you don't have to, if you're in a non-EFU farmland, you take the number of acres you have, and the number of acres times a dollar amount per acre is the amount of gross income you have required to have. That woodlot is not part of the acres that you have to count. Also, income, though, from the woodlot does not count against the income test for the non-EFU farmland. So it's just set aside. The land has to be growing trees, but there's no minimum parcel size. There's no requirements that it has to be commercial species or other things. It just has to be growing trees and it being adjacent to the woodlot. And it can't exceed 20 acres. If it does exceed 20 acres, then you have to get it into the designated forest land program, or cut the trees and start farming it, or it'll just be taxed as rural residential land or whatever it is. Here's a summary of those maximum specially assessed values. So forest land, so the classes FA through FX for Western Oregon. Most land here in the valley is FC. So we basically have a assessed value of $509 an acre. We take that value per acre times the tax rate, which is about 1.5%, depending on what county you're in. And so that's the amount of tax. So $500 an acre is not the amount of tax that you owe, that it's the value upon which the tax is based. The FA is basically the top value. Those are our coast range, really fast growing stuff. FX is basically land that is not growing trees. So it's a rock outcropping or something like that. That's basically, again, just kind of holding the world together, and it's basically non-productive. And then Eastern Oregon, all Eastern Oregon farmland, or all Eastern Oregon timberland is valued at $86.73 an acre. If you're in the STF program, the maximum specially assessed value is there. And the maximum specially assessed values are the values that are being used this year because they are less than the special assessed values. And so again, that information is in Appendix 2. That 97 legislature, again, in response to people that were wanting to manage their land, not for timber production, but to enhance and protect fish and wildlife habitat, they created this other program, which basically allows people that are doing conservation to also be taxed at, have their land valued based on either forestry or ag, depending on what kind of land it was. So it was created in '97. This program is actually managed by the Department of Fish and Wildlife, not the Department of Forestry. So they're the ones that oversee this program. The property has to be zoned EFU or farm forest or forest use only, or be identified by the county as a significant wildlife habitat area in order to qualify. So either has to be farm or forest property or be identified as a significant wildlife habitat in order to get into the program. You have to have a written conservation plan that's developed with practices in it that are going to enhance the fish and wildlife habitat. That conservation plan has to be approved by ODF&W. Once it's approved by ODF&W, then you apply to, depending on if you're in farmland or forest land, to either be taxed in farm special assessment or forestry special assessment. only 15 counties are, the counties have to opt into this program, and only 15 counties so far have opted into this program. And so I've got them listed here. So landowners in these counties that want to do conservation plans can do this program. If you're not in one of these counties, then this program is not available. Finally, we have conservation easements. So if you have a conservation easement on your property, then you can also be taxed as forest land or farmland, even if your land, again, is up in the urban growth boundary. So you have to have a recorded permanent conservation easement that qualifies for the IRS charitable deduction. So it has to meet all the requirements for the charitable deduction in terms of being, it has to basically have conservation practices in it, and it's being, the conservation easement is held by somebody who can oversee it, and all the things that are required there. So once you have that written permanent easement in place, then either the landowner that claimed the charitable deduction or the easement holder has to file a written certification of easement and give a copy of the easement to the county. And then the county then will enroll this program either as specially assessed forest land, or the designated forest land program, or the farm program. And so you have to apply by April 1. There's actually a special form to apply for the conservation easement special assessment. But they basically will value the land based on what kind of land it is, what the zoning is, or what the surrounding uses are, even if the land has a higher market value for other purposes. And with that, we're ready to open up for questions. I did want to say, there's been a lot of activity around property taxes and severance taxes and harvest taxes in the legislature this year. And it's been really interesting to watch what's been happening there, because we see some people, they want to reimpose the severance tax. They say, we want to put timber back on the tax rolls, or we want to charge landowners for the privilege of harvesting their timber, and either based on the, so in addition to the forest products harvest tax, they want to actually have a much larger tax, again, to go to the counties. Some of them are looking at it based on board feet. Some are actually looking, again, based on value. And some of the proposals are to tax it based on what you receive from the mill. Other ones, basically, you have to compute a stumpage value, and that would be the value of the severance tax. And so there's a lot of discussion around that, with the feeling that maybe forest landowners aren't paying enough in taxes, although we are paying income taxes when we sell that timber, like any other farmers or producers are paying the taxes. We're paying property taxes on our land, paying income taxes on the sale of our products, and so so that's going on there. There's also discussion about the harvest tax, about what things it's funding and where the money's going and how much that should be. I don't see a lot of effort. Well, the STF program, they want to change that around, and so there's anyway. Everything's on the table every year, and but today, no tax bill for property or severance tax has yet made it out of committee to the floor and been voted on and sent to the governor. So we're hopeful we'll be able to get out of the session. But there's something something that is on the table, and there's people that would like to change and substantially increase the amount of taxes that forest landowners have to pay on their lands and when they harvest. So Tammy, what kind of questions have came up as we were talking?
Sure. So we're going to go kind of back from the beginning. We're going to focus on the property tax and the severance and harvest tax first.
Okay.
So if a landowner decides to sell, as in small tract, does that landowner have to pay back taxes? Or is it possible to transfer that to the buyer and not have to pay taxes? And if so, how much?
Yeah, so if you sell your land, and if you're either in the designated forest land or the STF program, it is assumed, actually what will happen is that it passes over to the new landowner, the status does, and then the Department of Revenue, or the county actually, will send a notice of disqualification generally. And they basically what they do is they're giving the new landowner the choice of whether or not they want to continue in the programs. If the new landowner wants to continue in the programs, they just have to say that they want to continue, and it just continues. There is no back taxes that are owed or anything like that. If the new landowner wants out, then they'll be the ones that will be responsible for paying the back taxes for the length of time that the land has been in the program, either deferred, the designated forest land or the STF program up to the limits. And so if they want out, they're going to be subject to the back taxes, but only if they want out. If they want to stay in the program, as long as the land still qualifies, they can disqualify the land by changing the use or cutting the trees and not replanting, those kinds of things. So as long as the land still qualifies and they want to stay in the program, there is no tax event that occurs there's no automatic disqualification for them with the tax.
So really, I guess if I'm going to buy property, I need to understand if it's already enrolled in the program, if there's some reason that I don't want to be in it.
Yes.
Because it sounds like your decision, if I buy it from you, that your previous decision is going to impact me if I decide to change that decision.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's right. And so, and the STF and all those things, they flow with the program. And so, yeah, if you want out, it's like anything else. We all make decisions. We do things on our land, and for good or ill, the new landowner has to deal with it. And this is one of the things they have to deal with. The real challenge, though, is if this is something that does need to be disclosed. Generally, this would come up in a title report. But it is something that needs to be disclosed to the new buyer, what the tax program is.
So it's not quite a lien, but it has a little bit of characteristics of a lien, in that there is some responsibilities financially for taking it on. That's
correct. Yeah, there is no unpaid tax unless you decide to get out, and then they compute it at that point.
Right, but it is hanging out there.
Yeah, no, it is.
Great. All right, so there was a slide, there was a question about, so it's very helpful, but I still don't understand the slide about the 2003 legislation and at what point the forest products tax began to be imposed. Could you explain the switch from property tax to the forest products tax?
Yeah, so the forest products harvest tax actually was around before 2003, because it was a privilege tax that was put in place earlier to fund OFRI and to fund these other things. And so that tax had been around for a while, but what changed was getting rid of the severance tax. There was a severance tax that was owed, again, that what they call the partial exemption, where you paid, for the big landowners, they paid 30% of the value of the timber, before and 70% later. So anyway, that all went away in the 99 legislature changed the system and basically had a rollout that went through 2003. So 2003 legislature basically codified both programs, and so the harvest tax had been around for a while. The severance tax really had gone away in 99, except for the severance tax went away in 99 for the large landowners, but it stayed in place for the small landowners until 2003 when the new tax came along. So in 2003, and small landowners could choose to get into the designated forest land program in 99. Some of them did, some of them didn't. A lot of them were waiting around because they really like WOSTOT and they wanted to see what we were going to come up with to replace WOSTOT. And so by 2003, the designated forest land program had been firmly established, had been in place for a couple of years, and all the large landowners were in it, and many of the small landowners were in it as well. And basically everybody was, in 2003, everybody was put in designated forest land unless they wanted to opt in to the small tract forest land program. I have included in the materials on page 10 some of the advantages and disadvantages of the small tract forest land program versus the designated forest land program. So if you're confused and you're trying to figure out which program is best for you, I have some materials there on page 10 that kind of describe the pros and cons. like I said, it's supposed to be revenue neutral, but based on what you're doing, if you're grazing a lot more timber on your ground than what your site class would indicate, because you're intensively managing your ground, you probably would pay more in severance taxes than you would in property taxes, right? Because it's going to be based on kind of what the average person is going to grow and harvest over the life cycle. And if you have a lot of big timber on your property, you probably don't want to get in the STF program until you cut it and you're kind of starting over. And so there's things like that, and kind of pros and cons, how that works. And I would encourage you to review that.
Yeah, that's great. You went right where I was hoping you would go on the how to make that decision, right? It's really a function of where you're at in the cycle.
Yeah.
If you're sitting there today trying to make this decision, people ask, should I do it? Are you going to harvest next year? Then it's probably a bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
How far out you have that decision point is really just a function of how much timber you have out there and what that's going to look like. And of course, right now you can throw in the uncertainty of what will happen to that, potentially happen to that tax if you go in or out of it at this point.
Yeah.
So. All right. So a couple of questions. This is one of those things, Clint, that some of us, maybe a lot of us, get kind of sloppy in choice of words. And I'm not suggesting you did, but there's
I probably did.
Well, I think we're all guilty of it at some point, right? We start talking about things and there's a lot of pieces, right? So in this particular case, we have a harvest tax, we have a severance tax, and then of course you've used the word privilege tax. So would you just step back for a second and kind of define those three terms and what they're actually intended to do from a tax standpoint? Forget for a minute what Oregon is using them as, but when is severance appropriate as the right language versus the harvest? And then where does privilege fall in there?
Yeah. So this is all tied up with Oregon's Constitution and the way Oregon raises money and some of the ballot measures that Oregonians have, the limit restrictions we placed on our government. And so back in the 90s, with ballot measure 5 and then with measures 47 and 50, we significantly reduced what the government could do with property taxes. And so property taxes are subject to very hard limits in terms of how much tax they can raise and what they can do. And so in the pre 90s, we had these severance taxes that were put in place in lieu of property taxes. And so they were called a severance tax, but really legally they were a property tax. And so those property taxes were then subject to the ballot measure 5 limitations, and it was clear that they were, and there really wasn't any argument about it. So we have those taxes on property. We also have taxes on sales, and we basically, there's no law in place that says the government can't tax sales, except that it's the third political rail, right? It's the third rail. The legislator proposes a sales tax and they get voted out of office. And so nobody wants to have something called a sales tax. And then we have the income tax, right? And so we have those three. We have property taxes, sales taxes, and income taxes. Oregon doesn't have a sales tax. We have very limited property taxes. And then we all know what taxes on income are. And then we have things like fees. And so a privilege tax is a fee. It's a tax for the privilege of being able to do something. So the severance tax for the small tract, we call it a severance tax, but if you look in the language of the statute, it says, for the privilege of harvesting timber off of grounds that are enrolled in this STF program, a severance tax is imposed of X. And so that severance tax, we call it a severance tax, but legally it's called a privilege tax. It's a tax for the privilege of doing something. It's a fee the government charges us for doing something on our ground. And there's all kinds of privilege taxes that are out there for fuel, actually, they just put a new one in for cars. The sale of automobiles are now subject to a privilege tax. It's for the privilege of selling a car in Oregon. There's now a tax. It's not a sales tax. And so it's a tax for the privilege of being able to sell a car. And so we have these privilege taxes, and they're basically just fees that the government charges, and they're specifically referenced that way, so they're not thrown into the property tax part. And so what they're talking about doing now, and actually I think this is one of the challenges that a lot of the legislators are going to face, or that we're going to be challenging things in court, because they are describing these taxes as basically a tax on property, on the timber itself. And if it's just a tax on the timber, or on the harvest of timber based on the value of the timber, I think people are going to be able to say, hey, this is a disguised property tax. It should be subject to these other limitations. And so they have to be really careful as they draft these statutes, that they don't run afoul of these limitations that we, the taxpayers and the voters, have placed on our government.
Thanks. A couple of things that come to mind, when what we call a severance tax here in Oregon, and it's interesting how it became called that. Really, and that's, I think, why we hear people talk about it as the deferral, right? And so most people I talk to that know anything call it the deferral, right? And that's what it effectively is. It's a deferral of the property tax on the timber itself until the time.
Yeah.
So typically what I hear as a severance tax in other places is what we're calling a harvest tax, right? Which is you extracted a resource, or you severed a resource, and therefore you pay some kind of tax for that. So
yeah.
So great.
And so we pay severance taxes on things like you're mining gravel,
Mhm.
or we're taking oil out of the ground, or we're doing other things where we have this resource, and as we remove it, then the resource is gone, and it's kind of a found resource. And so we say that's a severance tax. When we sever it, when we mine, when we do whatever, then we pay a tax for that. And I think that the forest products industry made a really good argument. In fact, in Oregon statute right now, now the legislature can undo findings that they had in prior, the legislature is not bound by what it did in the past. But in the current statute, it basically says, timber is a crop. It's not a resource. It's not a natural resource. It's a crop that is raised by us. And so when we cut that crop, we shouldn't be subject to any taxes other than the income tax on the, or taxes that we agree to put on ourselves. Like the harvest tax is a tax that the forest products industry and the landowners have decided we want to tax ourselves through this harvest tax, so that we can get government services that we need, like the administration of the Forest Practices Act, like emergency fire funding, like Oregon Forest Resource Institute, the College of Forestry Extension. These are things that are important to the landowner community. And so we're willing to tax ourselves through this harvest tax to fund those things. So, and we're paying the general government through our income tax when we sell the timber.
Right. All right. So some more on STF. So just want to be clear, because there were a few questions on this.
Mhm.
The only time a seller is going to pay the back taxes, if you will, is if they want out of it before it sells, correct?
Yeah, so if they disqualify the land, or they request to get out of the STF program, and then so if they decide, hey, I'm going to have a timber sale and I want out of the program, so I don't want to pay tax, then yeah, they would have the STF, and they would be barred from re-entering the STF program. I think it's 5 years. So there's, you pay the rollout, and then and then you're barred from re-entering the program for a period of time before you can reapply.
Okay, and then we talked about some of the things that would disqualify you, but the question was whether a new buyer would not qualify due to size. If they were already in, unless there was some parcelization that happened in the sale. Can you think of any reason why?
That's possible, because the new landowner does have to qualify. So if that STF ground was bought by Weyerhaeuser, then it would roll out, because Weyerhaeuser is not a qualified owner. So I think if somebody bought it and they didn't have 10 acres of forest land in total, then they would not be a qualified purchaser, and they would be rolled out of the program.
Great.
I know one of the tax bills I looked at, they wanted to increase that 10-acre threshold to 60 acres. So again, they're trying to play around with this program, and we'll see what happens if anything actually makes it across the finish line.
That was a question that was directly posed to me, is trying to put some tighten the limitations on the size frames for people who qualify for small tracts, specifically trying to up the bottom side and then bring down the top side, trying to hit the right people who this particular group deems to be the right people. So that's going to be something I think that's going to continue to come up.
There were some people, I've had questions asked, why 5,000 acres? And the reason for that was back in the history, when they basically were looking at, they trying to come up with a dividing line of what's an industrial owner and a non-industrial owner. And they basically said, well, 5,000 acres kind of sounds like maybe the right number. And then the Department of Revenue went out and actually categorized all the landowners in Oregon as being either under or over. And so that work had already been done. And when we were creating the STF program, and I was on the group that created it, we didn't want to, one of the charges of this is we wanted to reduce the administrative costs of running the program. And since the department was already tracking the over and the under 5,000 acre people for other purposes, because there are several provisions in the code where over 5,000 acre people do not get the benefit that the under 5,000 acre people do. And so we decided just to use that same number so that the government didn't have to now go and figure out, okay, who are all the 4,000 acre owners or the 3,000 acre owners? Because it's not just direct ownership, it's also indirect ownership through entities. So if you have a family limited partnership or a corporation or something that owns timberland that you're also an owner of, you look through, and so all those things get added in to your individual ownership, and it's a complex thing, and it's a lot of work involved for the department to keep track.
All right, so here's a question on acquisition. So somebody's purchasing forest land, not sure what program it's currently enrolled in. I hear this question a lot, either when they're in the process of purchasing or they already have it. What is the best approach to answering the question about what they're enrolled in? Do they ask the county tax collector, the seller of the property, the title insurance company when you're purchasing it?
Yeah, you call the county assessor.
And
in fact, many counties have all that information online. You can just get if you have the tax lot information or the township check, you actually can look it up and it would tell you. But the easiest thing is just to call the assessor's office and give them the tax lot number, the tax account number, and they'll tell you what program it's in. Because you can't tell it from, all you can tell from the tax statement, property tax statement, is that the property's in some sort of, they'll just say a warning that the property's in a special assessment program. And it doesn't tell you what program it is, it just says it's there. So that would at least clue you in that there is some sort of it is being specially assessed.
All right, so we'll move over to the wildlife program. It says, comment and then a question with it. The wildlife program is not available in all counties. It is up to the county to allow or disallow the program.
Yeah.
ODF&W has had challenges in providing the required conservation plans. Has ODF&W corrected this issue?
I am not aware that they have, and in fact, so the actual drafting of the plan is on the back of the landowner, and while they can get help from anybody to help them draft the plan. So it's not the department actually is just one of the several, and in fact I may have listed that. I think I did in on pages 11 and 12. I do go kind of into the program a little bit, and so the landowner has to develop a plan, and they can do that with ODF&W. They can do it with Fish and Wildlife Service, with the NRCS, a city, a county, Saltwater Conservation District, Extension Service, or even just a consultant can help them draft the plan. It has to be approved by ODF&W. So, and my guess, so if you're looking for ODF&W to help you draft the plan, you're probably going to be waiting a long time because they have no, they're broke. they've got way too much to do and not enough money or people to do it. They're like all the other natural resource agencies are in the same boat. And so it's really up to the landowner to get that plan drafted and then ODF and W to play. So, working with, so I mean, there's cost share for some of this stuff too, right? These conservation habitat plans and stuff. So NRCS has cost share money for this kind of stuff. So, I mean, there's help, and there are consultants out there to help people draft these plans up. ODF and W just has to approve it. And I'm unaware that they have a backlog there. They could, but that's not near as much work for them to approve a plan as to sit down with a landowner and try to help you figure out what you want to do. That takes a lot of time.
So if a county is not using that wildlife program, is there a process to try to request that, or what can somebody do if they're interested in that?
Well, you probably need to have go and take your county commissioner out to lunch. Write them a letter or something and say, hey, this is a great program, and why haven't you done it? And, it's 97, right, when it was put into place. And so, everybody who was in office at the time this was put in place is now out of office, and the new people came in probably aren't even aware that this is out there. So yeah, it's an awareness thing. And I was surprised at some of the counties I didn't see on the list, who, they're really kind of into the conservation stuff. I mean, there's been a lot of money, a lot of energy put into this, and I was kind of surprised to see them not offering this to their landowners.
Great. All right. So we have a couple of things here. This is shifting off a little bit off, well, maybe not completely. Is the 1995 logging machinery exemption from personal property taxes available for LLCs?
Yeah, as long as you're in the logging business, I think that this exemption exists for. That's my understanding. It's based on the use, not on the owner. So if all businesses are required to pay personal property taxes on their equipment, and we got there was an exemption that was carved out for this logging equipment that was used in the business of logging. So I don't think it matters the form of business that you're in.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to shift off of it because I actually have one that's not property tax for you.
All right.
Please explain the way to distribute some of the LLC funds after a harvest to members. How is this done to avoid more income taxes, since LLCs are a pass-through for income tax payments? Is there a limit?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And so the LLC owners are going to pay income taxes on the net income from the sale. So if you sell $1 million worth of timber, I mean, you net $1 million after you pay all your bills, and you've got two owners. Each of them is going to pick up, and they're equal owners. Each of them is going to pick up $500,000 of income on their tax return, regardless of how much money you distribute to them. So that's what the pass-through taxation rules are about. The owners pick up all of the income that was earned by the entity, regardless of what was distributed. So because the owners have already picked up the income, or will pick up the income when they do their tax return, when you make a distribution, the distribution is not a taxable event. All you're doing is you're distributing money that they've already paid taxes on. So the distributions are not a taxable event. Most LLCs do not distribute 100% of their earnings because they want to keep some of it in the company to reinvest, or to hold for future years when they're not going to have a sale, or there's other reasons. So they can keep that money. That's all after-tax money for the owners as well. So let's say this year you just only decide to distribute $200,000 out of the $1 million, and next year you decide hey, we don't need the money, we'll distribute the other $800,000 the following year. That money coming out, they've already paid taxes on it. They paid taxes on the whole $1 million. They only received 200 of it. So the following year, when they get the rest of it, they don't have to pay taxes on that because they've already paid taxes. And so that's a short answer, is that distributions are not taxable for LLCs that are taxed as a partnership. S corporations, the rules are just a little bit different, but they basically follow the same idea. But the LLCs, basically all the income from these passive entities is taxed to the owners in the year that the entity earns it, not in the year it's distributed to the partners.
Great. So I'm going to go over to one that I've gotten before. So if you harvest in the year of purchase, so if you purchase timberland and you harvest within the year of the purchase, how's the sale reported? Since you didn't own the property on January 1, you can't have that deemed sale on January 1. So does it go to a C or an F?
Yeah. So if you buy the property and then you go in and hire a logger, cut logs and send them to the mill, if you don't own it for 12 months and a day, you do not qualify for Section 631A. So if you remember back the code section 1231, the sale of business property, there is no such thing as a short-term gain from the sale of business property. So if you have a 1221 asset, so you own it as an investment or as part of your personal residence or whatever, you sell that, you do have short-term gains and long-term gains based on if you've held it for 12 months or not. But if you turn around and sell it there, you're not going to have anything that goes on a capital gain schedule. If you sell it within 12 months of buying it, you're just going to report the sale of the logs on Schedule C if it's a business, or you're going to report it on page 1 as other income if you're not in business. And then you're going to have, so you're going to have your expenses that get deducted. So you'll be able to deduct your logging and hauling and your depletion, because you will have depletion. You just bought it. You're going to have cost basis in that timber. And so you would look at the amount of your cost basis that you allocated to the timber, and you'd be able to deduct that. But it's all going to be ordinary. If you're in business, if you have income, net income, that would be self-employment income. If it's an investment, then it's not self-employment income. So again, we kind of look back to those classification rules. But in order to have 631A gain treatment and have this deemed sale beginning of the year and all that, you have to have owned it for 12 months and a day, which means you'll have a beginning of the year number to look at.
Great. Well, that's all we have for today. I want to leave a couple seconds for wrap up. Couple minutes.
Thank you.
Great. It's been great having this session. Really appreciated it, and all your comments and everything. Thank you for participating. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Clint. That was an excellent session. And this has been a fantastic series. Clint, thanks so much for sharing all of your expertise with us this past 7 sessions. Thank you so much, Tammy, Dr. Cushing. I also want to make a note that Tammy is moving on from OSU, and so this is a little bittersweet. We're so happy that you've been with us and shared your expertise with us for the past couple of years. So thank you so much for being a part of this and for all that you've done. And I also want to say thanks to Mike Clausey and OFRI. They have given us quite a bit of assistance in coordinating and hosting these webinars throughout the series. And this is our last webinar before Mike retires in June. So thank you so much, Mike, for everything that you've done also, and for OFRI for supporting this series. I also just want to take a minute that the session was brought to you today by Oregon Small Woodlands Association. So we're a membership-based organization that uses membership dues to support educational events for Oregon's family forest owners like this, as well as woodland tours, presentations at chapter meetings, and an annual family forest convention that's open to the public and coming up on July 23rd. We also have a government advisory committee made up of members that meet to learn about current legislation, like bills that would deal with changes to the forest products harvest tax that was discussed today. And our members also get active in the legislative process through that committee. I'm gonna drop a link to our website in the chat and hopefully not mute myself again in the process like last time. There you go. I hope you'll consider becoming a member and contributing to our ability to providing educational events like this in the future. So thanks again for joining us today and for participating in our whole taxation series. This has been fantastic. We really appreciate it.